So it's nice to have a chance to talk about some brand new work, and this is work that is a part of a new project that I think we got the notice of award a couple of days ago officially. So this, at least for me, is the first time I've had a chance to talk with this little logo down here in the corner from the National Institutes of Environmental Health Science SRP program, which is one of the funders that has made this kind of work possible or grounded our proposal that we'll be working on for the next 5 years. I also have funding from the DOE to work here, in particular in this region on water quality related to uranium and arsenic. It's work that involves a lot of people.
Oop, I can help you out.
I have a set of students here, Adina Saku, DeLuca, and Janet Bow in particular, and Al Chiduri and Sarah Wilson also working on various things. I have a lot of collaborators across the faculty, most importantly, Steve Chillard and Anna Navas, both of whom are a big part of our research there at Columbia. And here I'm going to show data that has been collected with the help of Tracy in particular. And Marcia, I know Tracy's around here somewhere. There she is. I need new glasses, so I can't really see the back of the room very well. And also, Rick Cloud, I really want to acknowledge for his help in making our research possible. It doesn't seem to want.
Point it at my computer. All right, I can just tell me next slide then.
But this is really hard to see in here. One of the things I want to point out is, this is a wellness discussion, and one of the things, I'm an environmental scientist first. I want to point out, clean water is one of those things that's sort of fundamental to wellness. And our project has really here been focused on uranium and arsenic because it turns out water isn't always clean, and water isn't always clean in many places. But unfortunately here in South Dakota and elsewhere, it's especially not clean in some cases. If you do have, I want to point out a couple things that are really important to think about that are a little bit separated from the things I'm going to talk about, but maybe say something obvious, which is the best water is clean to start out with. Okay, so I'm going to say that, but it turns out it's a lot harder to figure out how to use that statement in a useful way. In practice, you have a well, and you may or may not know if it's clean, but you probably have to measure it in that case. But ideally, you'd like to know if the water was going to be clean when you drilled it, before you drilled it, because for those of you who drill wells, it's not cheap, right? So unfortunately, what usually happens is you put in a well and find out the water is bad or good, hopefully. But if you find out it's bad, you're unlikely to drill another one, and you have to fix the water. So a couple other things. If your water is not likely to be good, city water is a good alternative. Having somebody else responsible for keeping the water clean is a lot better than having you be responsible for it. Okay, all those things aside, one of the things I work on is if you don't have those options, which unfortunately a lot of people don't. I grew up in a house where we did definitely not have those options. We had to truck water in a truck 50 miles each way to take a bath, let alone to drink it. So I can certainly say that that's not the kind of thing everybody has, but it's certainly a goal to think about and how we provide clean water to everybody. Next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Let me get up on this shooter here, or I can walk over and see if it works if I'm closer. So the basic idea here is the following. If we have a site, these are pictures from here in Pine Ridge area. If I'm looking at a little body of water here on the surface, in this case, I'll call it a pond, whatever you want to call it. It's the edge of a pond, actually. There's water behind me. Or if I'm underground here, the question is, does that place have clean water? Is that water clean? And you might look at it and say, well, I wouldn't want to drink it. that's a different question a little bit. And in fact, it might actually be clean. But how do you actually tell? Now it works. Well, you actually have to measure it. There's a couple things to think about here, and that are pretty important to start thinking about. Well, why do you have to measure it? Maybe someone else, maybe the neighbors measured theirs. Is that good enough? Kind of depends, but in the end, usually, as an environmental scientist, I have to tell you some bad news. The answer is usually no. Your neighbor's not a very good predictor of what you have, unfortunately. So you really have to measure it, okay? And you might even have to measure it more than once, because the fact that you measured it and it was good today is not the same as assuming it's good always. There's a lot of responsibility in water. And it's usually worth it, because waterborne problems are a pretty significant health problem. So basically, how might we then be able to figure out how water is clean, where water comes from that is clean, how water is distributed in an environment, so that we could actually say something useful about where water is likely to be less clean than other places. And what I want to introduce to you is sort of a concept in hydrology. As a person teaching, I'm not a hydrologist either. Truth in advertising, I'm a chemist who worked at particle accelerators and studied, astronomy, and then became an environmental scientist, partly because I grew up, next to the second biggest Superfund site in the United States. So hydrology is new to me in some way, but what I want to make you think about is that connectivity and how water is connected and how you're connected to your environment. 50-50 choice.
There we go.
Okay, so here's a paper that we published a month ago, something like that, in the Lancet Planetary Health, looking at the distribution of uranium in water in actual public water supplies. So this is not private wells. These are actually city water across the United States. And what's important to realize here is uranium's higher than people thought it was. And surprisingly to me, as someone who assumed people had been keeping track of stuff like this, nobody had actually compiled the uranium concentrations in water across America until last month. So we were, looking at that, and what we find out is across America, 3% of wells have an unsafe level of uranium, which, by the way, is 30 micrograms per liter, which is way more than should be considered unsafe. So even using a completely high standard for water, which it's 25 years old, and before anyone bothered to look at anything basically toxicity-wise, it's going to go down, okay? And that's going to mean it's going to be more than 3% of wells are affected. And if you notice here in our western South Dakota corner, we're in one of those higher area corners. And it turns out we're also high here in arsenic. And so, next slide.
Oops.
So that predicated us starting to look at the population that would have high arsenic and uranium in drinking water across the Strongheart study regions. And here's a map showing a portion of that here in Pine Ridge, showing arsenic and uranium concentrations in groundwater, drinking water, essentially, but these in private wells. A couple things to note here. Again, a real number of people have arsenic in their wells, almost 30%. And almost 10% have both uranium, of course, where I am here now, almost 10% have both uranium and arsenic together, which is pretty unusual. And so as a geologist, someone who thinks about geology a lot, I can tell you, and who's worked on arsenic for a long time now, that's kind of an unusual trait and sort of something we wanted to understand more. So why might we have high uranium or arsenic? Well, there's a potential source downstream or upstream, I should say, excuse me, to here, and that is there's a big mine, one of very few. It's actually a very unusual mine. It's underground, but not digging it up mine. It's an in situ mining type of mining, which is sort of cutting edge, called Butte down in Nebraska. And Butte mine is a large uranium mine, essentially thousands of wells. And they inject water down there and they solubilize uranium and other things like arsenic, it turns out. And they recirculate it out of the groundwater and pump it up and recover the uranium from it. So one possible thing to think about is a place like this a source of uranium, for example, here, which is downstream. Water flows down, so potentially that's a real possibility. Okay, so how do we start figuring this out? Well, we have to start testing. And one of the things that is important to think about with testing is, on one hand, you think, hey, there's all these agencies out there collecting samples. There's all kinds of information. You'd kind of imagine that a lot of things have been tested and that all that data would be available. You'd be wrong on both counts. Almost certainly the data is not available. And on almost any place you go, almost certainly nobody's ever made a measurement there. So you actually have to go do it. It involves me and my student here in this case, actually going out in the river, in this case, or a creek, and tromping around and collecting water, bringing it back to the lab and testing it. And so that's what we do. The other thing, if we want to understand why water might be high in uranium or arsenic, we have to not only test the water, but we have to test the rocks. We actually have to go look at the rocks and the materials that water interacts with, because those waters, and whether they're bad for you or good for you, is determined by the chemical reactions between those solids and the water. So it's important to look at both together at the same places. It's not always as easy to do there as you think either. Okay, so you put all that together and we can start to do things like this, right? These are now a map. It's a map of surface water, so no well water here. Surface water locations across, again, the southwest corner of South Dakota, and a little bit of north in Nebraska in there, and to sort of look at the concentrations that we find across this region. Okay, and if you look at it in a map view like this, you get part of the information, but you don't get all the information, because unfortunately or fortunately, the Earth is kind of a layer cake structure. So there's a depth resolution there too. Some things are shallow, some things are deep. There's some river bottoms, there's some mountainous areas, a whole bunch of things in between that all affect the distribution across that. So I want to show you a little bit about how that works. Next slide.
There's also a laser pointer at the top, okay?
Yeah. I think it's just low battery. So here's an example of a sort of a hypothetical now, where I have a river. Oops, sorry, now it works.
Got it.
Where I have this river flowing sort of from the left to the upper right, okay? And there's different sites along it. And one of the questions is, if we have a site up here near the headwaters, like I drew as a star, that's a source of contamination. If you collect water along that river, what you're going to find is the water concentration upstream of that contamination source is going to be low. And then you get to the contamination source, and all of a sudden the water concentration gets higher. And then as you go downstream, that stream is integrating water from a bigger and bigger area. And that component of the contamination represents a smaller and smaller part of it. So what you start to see is initially near the site of contamination, the concentration's high, and then it dilutes as you go downstream. So if we had something like Butte spewing uranium into the water, that might be what we would expect as the water flowed by it. Okay? One nice thing, you can test this without actually getting permission. I can this audience, I think I'm safe in saying this, without getting permission to go into the ProView site to do this, because all you need to do is collect water at the stream outside at the bottom end and the top end. In contrast, it works if I point the pointer at the screen, which is kind of odd. Anyway, in contrast, if the site up there is not contaminated here, contributing to contamination, as you flow by it, the concentration doesn't really go up. And in fact, the concentration goes up gradually and slowly, assuming that it's sort of, there's a diffuse contaminant everywhere. And as that water flows, it just gradually sort of picks up steam and gets a little bit more and more and more. And if you happen to go by a little a confluence from another smaller side stream that is contaminated, that might go up a little faster because that new source is contributing. So all that hopefully makes sense to everybody. Turns out we can do some other things with that. So if we start looking at it here in a little bit more detail, you can start to see how we might make that useful. This is now a picture of the northern edge of Pine Ridge. This is the Arikaree Sand here, the sandy part of the sort of rolling hills of Pine Ridge. And if you look down into the Badlands here, so it's the upper part is lower elevation, and the White River is the blue line there. Mostly the water is flowing north and crops out in these cliffs that go down into the valley floor. Okay? What's important about that is if you look at the water up here is mostly actually pretty clean. And then the water, as you get closer to this cliff, where the land gets thinner and you start getting close to the boundary between them, or if you go into the Badlands, is where the water is highest in uranium. So in this case, the legend, you can see that there's high arsenic and high uranium down at the bottom in the White River, and there's less above. So hopefully that would tell you that whatever is happening, up here is not quite the same as down there. It had to go through a contamination source to get there. If we look at all the data here for these surface water samples, we get a plot like this. So this is now a graph that shows arsenic concentrations on the x-axis and uranium concentrations on the y-axis. A couple things about this. Real life data, talking to people who are used to epidemiological data, this, really bad data. Real life data is another level of slightly more normal, we'll call it, but not ideal. So you see a pretty clear trend there. You don't have to be a scientist probably to know that when one goes up, the other seems to go up too. Okay, and this is for all those different water samples collected literally from south of Chadron, Nebraska, all the way up to past Wombly on the upper end of Pine Ridge. Okay, and what you can tell from that is when water goes, is wherever water is, those two things are coming out together. And it turns out look at that. You can, if I just started to put the water quality standards there in things, you sort of divide this into quadrants. Where you see a group down here in the lower left that's low in both uranium and arsenic. You see a group up here that's high in both. And you have a few samples that are high in one or the other, but really you're going from quadrant to quadrant there. And if you look, the mine is down here, and the samples above and below the mine are all right here. And as we flow northward, we basically flow up in here to the bottom of the Badlands. So as we flow north, we're seeing an increase in concentrations. What that really means is, at least so far, it doesn't look like Crow Butte is the place where this contamination comes from. And in fact, what we can see is there's really almost a night and day transition where you get to this boundary between the two layers and we start to see high both uranium and arsenic, or some mixture of those two. So we saw that sort of in plan view a little bit here when we looked at data earlier, sort of as within this Strongheart study. If you look here at the a map, you can see that the boundary between the sand and the clay, here that boundary is sort of between that light color and the light brown, is actually where the concentrations of arsenic and uranium together are highest. And that's because the wells that are sampling near that in map view are also close to sampling the lateral view between them, where the contact is. It's just different ways of showing that. Now, something kind of amazing came out of this that I wasn't expecting, even as someone who's supposed to know what I'm talking about. The surface water, the water from the rivers, and the water from the ground, which are plotted in red, basically occupy the same range, concentrations. You don't really find that. In fact, usually we think of arsenic concentrations as being a groundwater issue and surface water almost never having arsenic. Okay, but in our case, we find both. And it actually, one of the things to think about are what else we can learn from this related to that. Now, what I want to also tell you that we might be able to use to help explain why that is here. So going back to this, if we have this gradual increase in arsenic or uranium concentrations, because they're both increasing, we can actually use other chemical constituents in the water to figure out where it came from. And if we do that, for example, sulfur, if the sulfur concentration goes up together with it, and proportionally, then we might say, hey, maybe a chemical reaction that involves sulfur is present. And indeed, here's the concentration of arsenic, and sulfur is shown on a logarithmic scale here because it varies more. But again, we see pretty clear relationships between the two. So high arsenic is found where there's sulfur, as sulfate present, and what we can tell from that are things like this chemical reactions are actually where that arsenic is coming from. Right? We start to be able to do something useful with that. One, that means if we want to stop the arsenic from getting into the water, we want to stop this chemical equation. We have to remove a reactant. Is one way to think of it, right? We have real functional things we can think about. We could also think about remediation as a way of making the reaction go backwards. So we can do that and sort of come up with these stories for how things are happening. And I just want to show you sort of a schematic that we've sort of put together that sort of explains how things are. Here we have these rolling hills of Pine Ridge. We have a water table underneath. We've got some houses in different locations, right? If you live on the top of a hill and you put a well in, you don't put the well at the very really shallow, you go deeper. Why? You don't want your well to go dry. And wells in sand go dry pretty easily. If you're on the edge over here of on the boundary between layers, your well can only go so deep, and it's already right on the edge of that contact. But we have this contacted zone here in the middle, laterally, which is extensive, that if you're really next to it there, you're going to have high arsenic in uranium. And of course, the springs that come out over here are definitely going to have high arsenic in uranium. So water flows down to that clay on the bottom and then flows sideways out into the valley floor over here. Here's what it looks like in actual map view, right? You take a picture, you can see the sand at the top overlying that clay. And in fact, the bottom part of the sand is actually, or looks like part of the clay, but it's actually solidified because this chemical reaction and flow has actually brought the sands together and stuck them together. And unfortunately, if you look at this sort of rolling hills, that contact, can I get one more slide forward? If you look outside of the edge, where not next to the Badlands, the low points in the environment, like are where this water is here, for example, at the bottom of this picture, are all close to that contact to begin with. That's why they hold water. Unfortunately, that means that those environments also, both the surface water and the groundwater, are likely to be high in arsenic and uranium. Now, we can do some cool things with that, one of which is to look at the soil, the solids now, in a system. So this is a particle accelerator called a synchrotron. It's my tool of choice to study how the environment works. It's cool because you can actually take soil in there directly, just literally put it in there without doing anything, and make maps on microscopic scales that allow us to observe contaminants in their chemical forms and the chemical reactions that are happening in situ. So you take a picture like this, and a couple things are important to see. if you actually, so this picture has 3 different colors. Iron is red, uranium is green, and arsenic is blue. Couple things, none of them overlap. They're all found in different systems, in different environments. Yeah. That's interesting because that just isn't normal. In normal life, arsenic always sticks to iron. In fact, that's why normal groundwater is good to drink. It's usually iron oxides remove arsenic from water and make it safe. That's actually why you drink water from a well, right? So when we see this environment, we know something very different is happening. Next slide. So, and we can actually see that this is now a correlation showing for that map of looking at all those sand grains individually. In fact, in this case, it's uranium versus iron. Again, no real relationship there. You don't have a sand grain with more iron that has more arsenic or uranium on it.
Oops, there we go.
All right, so you put all that together, and here we have finally the last slide here. Next, I'll do one more. I'm going to skip that one.
Okay.
Sort of the picture here is now we can actually add a little bit more detail on this chemistry. What we have these solids up here in the unconsolidated sands that contain solids that don't really want to be there. They were deposited this way. The water flows through and it basically weathers. It oxidizes. Makes uranium and arsenic that are oxidized that then flows with the water and collects down here along the boundary. That boundary is exactly what they mine in Butte. They go down there and they just pull. That's where they're putting in all their wells and sucking that out naturally. Okay, and what happens if you go further, that the water as it flows, then it precipitates in that zone, and then those things just slowly precipitate and dissolve as the water flows. And it's a source of arsenic and uranium that keeps on giving, unfortunately. You pull water faster, arsenic and uranium will just keep dissolving. And what we actually have is more than enough arsenic and uranium in the water to provide a source of arsenic and uranium to your drinking water, where it matters, for a very long time. So because this is a geologic process, it's had millions of years to get there, and unfortunately, it will take a long time to get out of it too. So it's a long-term problem. Okay, I'll stop there so I can answer questions.
Okay.
That's good.
Yeah, we have a minute for any questions. Anything in Zoom we need to ask?
Yeah.
How do you remove it? And at the source of drinking, are there systems that can either chillate, pull it off, or mechanically reduce to what would be considered healthy?
So a couple things. Indeed, it's hard to remove. So the reason that it's actually dissolved is these waters form dissolved complexes of carbonate that really complex the uranium. They're already chelated in the water. And so that has several outcomes. One is you have to put in a chelator that's stronger to ruin it and break it so that you can do something else. Chelators that are stronger have other things that you don't want. It's usually a bad idea to drink very strong chelators. But on top of that, it means that the water treatment mechanisms don't really work. And so our approach to treating this is really that we have to change the chemical forms of arsenic and uranium in the water and introduce iron oxides that are then have extra surfaces available to treat it. So that's actually what we're trying to do, is develop a water treatment system that's able to do that.
Oops.
That's pretty quick. Okay, oh, that's
I can pull it up. What?
But the answer is most personal treatment systems that people use
This one, Ben?
don't work. They're, even when they're working properly. Certainly. So part of what our Superfund research grant is to do is looking at these environmental contributors to disease. It is very likely that unsafe levels of arsenic and uranium being pretty widespread are in water, or they're linked in many places to significant health outcomes. Cancers, yes, but okay, this is actually where cancers, I wouldn't say a red herring, but it turns out that heart disease, for example, in our cohorts that we've worked in Bangladesh, where we have for a long-term study that's and levels of arsenic are really a little bit higher, obviously, than here. But we find in Bangladesh that the odds ratio for mortality is doubled at 100 parts per million first, mostly from actually from heart attacks. So, but there's all arsenic is like one of those metals that basically screws up everything. It doesn't just have like a single thing that it interferes with. It interferes with a whole bunch of things. So it's, it has neurological outcomes, heart disease, diabetes. Those are all things that we've looked at in our superfund programs. But yeah, it's sort of like walking up to a giant mixing board and messing every volume up, and then expecting your new sound to come out good. It just doesn't work.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bostick.